CensusFail a hack, attack, or stack?
And should we pay much attention to Netflix speed tests? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Alcatel. Welcome to Vertical Hold, the tech show where we channel surf through the headlines in search of the big picture. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm here with a man who doesn't yet appear on the Australian census, non-person Alex Kidman. Alex, what's new in tech?
Netflix has released its July Australian speed rankings based on primetime streaming speeds. Optus tops the list and Telstra is last, but with only just over 1 meg separating the two, and averages well under 5 meg, simple reality remains that Australian broadband quality still absolutely stinks.
Facebook is stepping up the war on advertising, with plans to bypass desktop ad blockers to ensure you see the ads when looking at Facebook in your desktop browser. The change is designed to trick ad blockers into thinking that the ads are legitimate content, although it probably won't take long for the ad blockers to block the efforts to block the ad blockers from blocking ads.
Qualcomm's chipsets run a huge proportion of available Android devices, and this week has seen the announcement of a very serious security flaw in the company's chips that could leave untold numbers of handsets potentially vulnerable. For now, attacks would have to be specifically written, but it might be wise to lay off sideloading iffy-looking apps for the time being until patches are made available.
Apple still refuses to grant Australian banks direct access to the NFC chip in iPhones so they can offer competing services to Apple Pay, with Apple insisting it would fundamentally diminish security. The ANZ Bank is the only one of the Australian Big Four banks not pushing for the change, having already struck a deal to be the first Australian Apple Pay partner. So, Alex, Facebook's trying to block the ad blockers from blocking the ads. What do we think about that?
Look, ad blocking is one of those kind of contentious topics, and I have two kind of competing views that bounce around in my head in relation to it as a general topic, because obviously as someone who works in the media, as are you,
yes,
ads kind of pay for the rent and keep food in our children's stomach and things like that, you know.
We do have a vested interest in this argument, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got to kind of make that clear to start with. At the same time, it is and always has been a bit of a cat and mouse game, and there is a level to which I think advertising can be done well and can be beneficial. Equally, there's a level to which it can be horribly irritating and annoying and counterproductive. Getting that balance right is no easy task. Ad blockers that are applied willy-nilly, just kind of, right, kill everything, I want no ads. Yeah, that's not necessarily supporting media models, and that's a bit of a problem. Obviously, media models also need to adapt. Facebook is an interesting one here, of course, because it can run on all that demographic data that we give it for free. So its ads should be super targeted, but all too often they're just not.
Well, I turned off my ad blocker today so I could take a look at the ads in Facebook. I do have been turning it off recently. Mine's a granular one, so I can turn it off for individual sites. And I've started to hit some of the sites that I read that have said, can you please turn off your ad blocker so we can pay our writers? It's like, well, some of those writers are my friends. So yeah, all right, I'll do that. But I was actually surprised that the ads weren't worse on Facebook, because I didn't even realize I was blocking the ads, because these things pop up in your feed all the time that you swear you didn't want to see that feel a hell of a lot like ads. So when I turned off the ad blocker,
they're ads.
Well, exactly. So when I turned off the ad blocker, all I saw were two more things on the side of the page, and one of them was for VPN services and the other one was for luggage. So clearly it had been following stuff that I'd been looking at recently, and they were fairly targeted ads and they weren't that intrusive. But so on Facebook, I don't know if it'll actually make as much of a difference, but once they know they can block them, then they could become worse. And when you get these stupid ads that take over the page and all this rubbish, that's what drove people to ad blockers in the first place. So if they can keep it simple and keep it in check, I think maybe people will be happy with that balance. They've just got to remember that at the end of the day, if your ads are offering a terrible user experience, then users are going to find ways to get around it.
Yeah, look, Facebook must know a fair amount more about you than it does about me, because I don't run an ad blocker on Facebook. And look, the ads it serves in that sidebar, yeah, I agree, they're not intrusive. They don't actually stress me that much, which is why I don't really bother to block them. But they're almost uniformly rubbish. They're weird, things that I'm not interested in and that I haven't largely searched for. Every once in a while, I'll get a technology topic and I'll think, oh yeah, I searched for that. Okay, it's doing its job. But for a lot of the time, they're just junk. And they're junk that really they're not actually doing anyone any favour. I'm never going to click on them because they're junk. They're not actually doing the advertiser any favour because they've been misapplied to me for whatever reason. So I think there's a bit of, algorithm fiddling that needs to be done there as well. But yeah, I agree broadly. The balancing act is a hard one, and I think the battle is one that's never actually going to stop.
So Alex, Census Day has come and gone. Did you manage to stand up and be counted?
I didn't so much manage to stand up as be counted, but try to get to my feet only to discover that the census website had fallen over. So as far as I can tell, the population of Australia consists of Malcolm Turnbull, because he specifically tweeted that he did do his on the evening. Is that correct? Did you manage to get through? That's going to screw up their numbers.
Yeah, I did actually manage to get in. I waited until my kids got home from school. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I said, right, kids, it's Census Day. And if we wait until after dinner, the website's going to crap itself when everybody tries to log in at the same time. So let's do it now. So we filled it out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and it all went fine. And then after dinner, it crapped itself. And I said to the kids, see, I told you.
See, I took the alternate view that, yes, they've said, hey, look, fill it in on the evening of Tuesday the 9th. So I did, or at least I tried to, and it fell over, and I wrote lots of jokes on Twitter about it and had an awful lot more fun, I think, than I would have had I actually just filled it out in the boring, mundane way. But yeah, I think Blind Freddy could have seen that it was going to get extremely hit hard in that period. But what's interesting here is a lot of what's come out since, because we've had various government departments playing the blame game with each other. At first it was a denial of service attack, but that seemed like an inevitability because they said, hey, this is unhackable. And as soon as you say that to the broader internet community, it's like, ooh,
all right, I'll take it.
Let's hack that. But having said that, the global traffic patterns did not suggest any large-scale hacking, any large-scale denial of service. Hacking is a slightly different thing, and I'm going to get my terms very, very correct here. Because there are attacks, there are hacks, and then there are the point at which it just falls over because it's stacked. And it appears that it was a bit of a mix of all three. Some of the work done by Patrick Gray, who hosts an excellent security podcast you should listen to called Risky Business, uncovered some of the details of what seems to have happened, and what looks like it happened was that IBM, who were providing the back-end services to run the whole thing, more or less kind of ignored some of the services that they could have used, threw it all into fairly obviously easily clogged channels. It wasn't stress tested to the level it was likely to hit for the evening, because as you said, everyone could kind of see, well, actually the evening is when it's going to be worst. Their claims up front were, we figure it's going to, be capable of, I think it was 1 million people an hour. Well, actually there's probably about 8 to 10 million Australian households, something along those lines, and they were all going to try and do it in about that 3-hour span. So you need a great deal more capacity, and they didn't get it. But the blame game has shifted here and there and everywhere. And it still leaves a bunch of other open questions as well. Not
just the blame game, but also the way they were explaining it. They couldn't even get their story straight. On the night, they implied it was some kind of service outage, and that you should come back soon because it will be fixed. And they left people hanging till 11 o'clock until they said, come back tomorrow, even though they had decided at 7:30 to switch the damn thing off. The next morning it was an attack, and then suddenly, no, it wasn't an attack. It was an attempt to frustrate, but we don't want to call this an attack, so it was a non-attack attack. Then so we had arguments about what does attack mean, and then in the end they said, no, well, it was an attempt, but it didn't work because they non-attacked attacked us, but then we switched it off before they could win, so we won. I think. I don't know if there are any winners in that.
And at the same time, I mean, having tried to do it on and off on Tuesday night myself, and seeing a lot of the reactions of people on social media to do it, there were sections of that site that seemed to be loading that did not seem to have been switched off. So whether the whole we actually switched it off was a porcupine, quite why they couldn't get their communication channels together if they did switch it off, to simply say at 7:30 or at 8 o'clock if they've decided, right,
sorry,
the
close
Pimps
for
and Paul,
business.
Exactly. Just say, sorry, close for business, come back tomorrow and we'll talk to you. As it is, the site itself has come back up this afternoon as we're recording this, but with shaky availability, depending on who you talk to and who's trying to actually...
Please form an orderly queue, maybe A to K today, L to Z tomorrow, or odds and evens for households. Just don't all rush it again.
Which also raises this kind of issue that the whole point of the census is it's meant to be the snapshot of the nation at a fixed point in time.
Yeah.
And there's always been a bit of a rubbery nature around that because people are travelling and you get people who fill out the forms late and that kind of thing. But it's meant to be this snapshot. That moment has passed, and it's passed in a way that does not inspire confidence. There was already an awful lot of complaining, some justified, some not, about the security and privacy of the data being collected. That's not going to have got any better given this particular debacle, which raises this question of whether or not it's worth continuing with what we've got for those who did get in, yourself and Malcolm Turnbull, essentially.
Yes, Malcolm and I, yeah.
Yeah, you're very close, obviously. Or starting again. And I think I really think it's worth pointing out the census is well worth doing. The issues around names and privacy.
Oh yeah, there's no question about that.
But the statistics it generates are incredibly useful for planning an awful lot of incredibly vital services that affect everyone. You, me, everyone.
Them. But the point is that it was already screwed. It was not because of what happened the other night, but because of the fact they let people fill it in online. You're supposed to fill it in on, what was it, August 9, and some of the questions, depending on which boxes you tick, ask you about things that happened in the last 2 weeks. Did you look for work in the last 2 weeks? Did you care for children in the last 2 or 4 weeks? Because this thing is online, people were filling this thing out 3 weeks ago. I was talking to someone the other day who said they filled it out at the start of the week because they knew this was going to happen, and someone else they knew filled it out 2 or 3 weeks ago. So the data is already wrong. Now I can fill it out. You can fill it out tomorrow and talk about what happened the last 2 weeks and go back a couple of days. But people who filled it out 3 weeks ago, absolutely wrong, because they can't talk about the 2 weeks what happened to them before the actual date. So the fact, you can't argue, oh, now that it's a day or two over, chuck the whole thing away, because if you were prepared to accept it as it was already skewed and stuff. So I don't think this is good enough reason to chuck the whole lot away and start again.
Now, I'm informed because, as I said at the top, I still have not...
Well, that's a change. Alex is informed, all right? Hang on, let me write down the time and the date.
Dead to me, Turner. You are dead to me. Or at least you will be when the bullet hits. That being said, I'm reliably informed that, in fact, one of the online questions within the census asked whether or not you'd actually access the internet.
That one. Yeah, do you use the internet? It's like, maybe. I think I'm using it right now.
The next, of course, question is what happens with all of this, and especially what happens with the privacy side of it, which is the bit we haven't touched on. This idea that your name is linked into it.
Well, I kind of think that's a whole different argument. I am a bit uncomfortable with that, and I did weigh up the pros and cons of using an alias, and I decided in the end that it was not worth it. But I can totally understand people's concerns about that, particularly when you look at their method for, depersonalizing or stripping your name away from the data, but leaving a identifier code, which looks pretty easy to actually reverse engineer and figure out what your name and address actually was. So yeah, I'm not too thrilled about that. But it's one of those situations, and I hate people that say this, but people who say, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. I don't agree with that attitude. I think that's a bad attitude. But in this case, I decided that I thought that was okay. But if there was something about my family that was a bit out of the ordinary, our religion or something like that, then I would have been very tempted to fudge that on the census. So when they decided to round those people up, they didn't find us.
Yeah, look, it's a tough one. And it's a tough one both from that level of government intervention. There is previous historical precedent for people identified on a census as being of a particular nationality or religion or whatever being targeted because they've said that. But equally, of course, there is also this issue of personal identifiers against hacking attempts, against people actually trying to steal all that data, because as soon as you've got all that data on me or on you, well, hello, identity theft. There is a genuine issue there. And the way they've handled, of course, the whole thing going offline and what looked to have been some false positives of a small-scale attack, because there's no seeming evidence of a very large-scale attack having happened on the 9th. There may have been smaller-scale attempts, but there's no evidence of a huge influx attack, except, of course, several million Australians trying to fill out the census like the government told them to.
Yeah.
But if that kind of data gets into the wrong hands, there's a huge problem there, unless, of course, we all want to rename ourselves to be, Corey Bernardi, a lesbian Muslim from Athens.
Oh, yeah, I know. We went to school together. Nice guy. But I can understand why they pulled the thing, because if television's taught me anything, it's that denial of service attacks are usually a distraction while they try and do something else. So I can understand why they kind of panicked and pulled the plug on the thing. I think they maybe did the right thing there. They then did the wrong thing by not telling us what was going on. But also what you're saying about people's names and stuff like that, they did such a bad job of managing it beforehand. They didn't so much as try and allay people's fears as just say, don't be stupid. They really had this attitude of, what the hell are you talking about? You've got nothing to worry. Don't you worry your little head about it. And as soon as you start talking to people like that, they get their back up because they've heard that story before. So they did a really bad job of managing it beforehand, which meant they had zero goodwill before they even got to the census. And then when all this went down, it was just all over.
So Adam, Netflix has released the Fast app. And what is it the Fast app does?
Well, Netflix is very keen for us all to test our download speed, or not so much our download speeds, but our Netflix performance. And I don't think it's so much. I don't think it's so much because they care about what our speeds are or anything else. I just think they're trying to shame ISPs, particularly in the US, because there's always argy-bargy with is Netflix traffic being deprioritized. They want to make it very clear to customers whether or not they're getting good Netflix experience. In Australia, it's less to do, I think, with your ISP dialing down Netflix and more to do with just the infrastructure being rubbish. But it's the same thing. So they want you to see there what you're actually getting. But I'm not convinced this app is so great. I downloaded it. I fired it up on my iPhone, which was connected to my home Wi-Fi network, and it said that I was getting 4.8 megabits per second. Which I bloody love to get 4.8 megabits per second, but I know my internet connection ain't that fast. So I checked my broadband modem and I actually had a line sync of 4.1 megabits per second. So that is the fastest possible speed I could get, is 4.1. So there was something very wrong. When I did a speed test, it said I was only getting 3.3 megabits per second, which is what you'd expect when you leave a bit of overhead. So I don't see how I can trust an app that tells me my Netflix speeds are faster than my actual internet speed. And at that point, you've got to question the rest of it as well. Like, I tried it in the browser, and all the rest added up to 3.3. So I don't know what kind of mathematical argy-bargy they're using, but I'm not convinced it's the most reliable of tools. But as I said, it's not meant to be a proper network analyst tool. It's just meant to be a way to name and shame ISPs.
See, I don't know if it's... I agree, in the States, it's definitively a name and shame tool because they've got that whole argument about prioritising traffic.
Yeah.
I think the idea is meant to be, broadly speaking, is also though meant to be this thing where Netflix wants to push people towards ISPs who can offer them higher performance because their Netflix looks better, because then people stay on Netflix for longer and give Netflix more money. Money is still the end game here. And I mean, I'm not discounting your experience either, although obviously internet connections generally can vary over time. So unless you're able to do all this in an absolutely synchronous fashion, things can go up and down. But all of those speed test tools are the same in this. They're not terrible indicatives, but they're definitely not absolutes in that sense. And I mean, it's interesting they've released this at the same time. We mentioned this in the news as they released their Australian net speed rankings. Theoretically, Optus could go out there and say, we are the fastest, rah, 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 until you actually look at the numbers and realise that even with NBN and cable, both of which should be way higher, factored in, nobody's hitting even 5 meg per second for downloads, which means everybody on average is delivering standard def Netflix.
Yeah, those numbers are total rubbish. They don't mean anything because they're not allowing for what we'll take Optus and Telstra, not allowing for what mix of customers they have on fibre, what mix of customers they have on cable, and what mix of customers they have on DSL. I could start an ISP tomorrow and totally nail that. All I would have to do is sign up 10 customers on fibre, and that's it. Have no customers on DSL or anything to drop my average. Any ISP that's got a lot of customers on DSL, it's dragging it down. So the biggest influence on your internet performance is not so much a choice of ISP as to do with the crappy piece of copper line running to your house. There is, as we've talked about in the past, there are contention ratios and other things in the network infrastructure that can change your speeds and what kind of pipe your ISP has. But when you're like me and you're at bloody miles from the exchange and you're on a 4 megabit per second piece of crappy copper, that is your biggest problem. and no changing of ISPs is going to fix that. So I think once we have, well, we're not getting a level playing field anymore, but if we had have got a level playing field and everybody got 100 megabits per second fiber, then this would be a useful tool. As it is, it's like trying to judge which roads in the city have the best tar by looking at peak hour traffic speeds. That's how ludicrous the whole thing is.
Well, that just about wraps it up for this episode of Vertical Hold. Remember, if you've got any comments, hit us up in the comments section on YouTube, via Twitter, or the Facebook Vertical Hold page.
Thanks for joining us, and remember, if you like what you hear, hit that subscribe button. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Alcatel.